There is a room in the world that changes you the moment you enter it. You do not know why, not at first. The light is the same. The air holds the same weight as outside. And yet something is different. Something in the proportion of the walls, in the way the ceiling rises above you, in the soft, sourceless pressure of the silence. You stand still without meaning to. You lower your voice without being asked. You feel, in a way that has nothing to do with thought, that you are inside something that understands you better than you understand it. Ancient architects built thousands of rooms like this, across every continent, in every age we call old. The people who designed the world's most enduring structures understood something about the relationship between shape and sensation, between geometry and the human body, and between proportion and the mind. They understood it so thoroughly and applied it so precisely that the buildings they left behind still produce the same effect on visitors today that they produced on the people who first walked through their doors 4,000 years ago. We have been taught to admire these structures as achievements of engineering, as monuments to religious devotion, as evidence of sophisticated civilizations. What we have not been taught, what the textbooks leave out, is the deeper question sitting at the center of all of it. Where did the knowledge come from? How did people working with copper tools and wooden sledges encode, in stone, proportional relationships that modern scientists are still working to explain? How did they do it so consistently, so precisely, and so universally that the same mathematical ratios appear in a pyramid in Egypt, a stone circle in England, and a temple buried in the jungles of Cambodia? Somewhere in the world right now, a structural engineer is staring at a measurement she cannot explain. The building she is analyzing is 4,000 years old. Her instruments are the most precise ever made, and the numbers she is seeing, they should not be possible. Not because the numbers are wrong, because the numbers are too right. Consider this. The Great Pyramid at Giza encodes the mathematical constant pi to 4 decimal places of precision, not approximately, not incidentally. The perimeter of the pyramid's base divided by twice its height gives you 3.14159. And that level of precision would not appear in a published European mathematical text until the 3rd century before Christ, 2,000 years after the pyramid was already standing. Consider also that on the plains of Cambodia, a temple built 900 years ago mirrors, in its geometric layout, the position of a specific constellation as it appeared in the night sky 12,500 years ago. The builders were not looking at their sky. They were looking at a sky that no living person in their era had ever seen. And consider the stone circle on the Salisbury Plain in England, whose acoustic properties are being studied by sonic engineers at leading universities. Engineers who have found that the resonance of the chamber does something measurable to the human brain, something the ancient builders appear to have intended. And these are not myths. They are published findings, sitting in peer-reviewed journals, waiting for someone to ask the obvious question: how did anyone know to build it this way? These are questions that deserve more than footnotes in academic journals. They deserve funded research, excavation permits, and the same institutional commitment we bring to the exploration of outer space. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about what lies beneath the Giza Plateau. We have mapped the ocean floor more precisely than we have mapped the subsurface of Stonehenge. The decisions that created these priorities are not scientific. They are political, and they can, at any moment, be unmade. This is not a story about ancient aliens. It is not a story about magic. It is something stranger, and in certain ways more unsettling than either of those possibilities. It is a story about knowledge, specific, technical, mathematical knowledge that appears to have existed long before our history says it should have. Knowledge that was encoded in the only medium that survives for 10,000 years. Knowledge that was cut into stone. And the geometry, if you know how to read it, is still there. The usual story about ancient architecture goes something like this. Civilizations arose. They developed religion. Religion demanded temples. Temples required labor. Labor was organized by rulers. And so, through sheer human effort, directed by devoted belief, the monuments of the ancient world were built. It is a clean story. It is a satisfying story. It fits neatly inside the frame of what we think we know about how history works. Yes, the problem is that the buildings do not cooperate with the story. When acoustic archaeologist Dr. Rupert Till brought his recording equipment to Stonehenge and played sounds within a scaled acoustic model of the original, complete structure, the results surprised him. The stone circle resonated at a specific frequency, a frequency that, when cross-referenced with neuroscience research, turned out to be one of the few sound environments documented to produce measurable shifts in human brain activity. The prefrontal cortex quiets, the amygdala calms. The part of the brain responsible for spatial awareness and emotional depth becomes more active. People who have studied this response describe it, almost universally, with a word that sounds old: presence. The ancient people who built Stonehenge were, according to the measurements, engineering that experience into the stone. This finding did not make the front page of any newspaper. It appeared in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. It was noted at an academic conference in Bath, and then it returned to the shelf, where it sits alongside hundreds of other documented anomalies from ancient structures that have been carefully measured, carefully published, and carefully ignored. On the other side of the world, in Bosnia, thermographic surveys of a pyramid-shaped hill revealed something that standard thermal physics does not predict. Heat signatures moving upward through the stone structure in concentrated columns, emerging from the apex in a pattern consistent with a focused beam of energy. The geologists who measured this described their findings in the precision that academic language requires, and noted that no natural geological process they were aware of produced this behavior. They simply recorded that it was there. Back in Egypt, materials scientists studying the granite used in the inner chambers of the Great Pyramid complex found trace elements arranged in configurations that do not correspond to any known natural geological formation pattern. The granite was quarried 800 miles away, transported by methods that remain genuinely unknown, and placed with millimeter-level precision. But the material itself, the stone itself, contains something that the surrounding bedrock does not. Whether this is coincidence or selection, no one has published a definitive answer. The question remains open. The papers are filed. The scientists have moved on to more fundable work. A university researcher puts down her instruments and says, "This building is behaving like a machine. I just cannot figure out what it is designed to do." She is not on a fringe science podcast. She is presenting at the Royal Institute of British Architects. The most unsettling thing about these findings is not that they exist. It is that they exist inside the peer-reviewed literature, confirmed, cited, methodologically sound, and yet they appear in no history curriculum anywhere in the world. The papers are real. The data is real. The scientists who produced them are real. What does not exist is any serious, funded, institutionally supported attempt to follow the evidence to its conclusion and ask, what were these buildings actually for? What did the people who built them know? And why does no one in a position of authority seem particularly interested in finding out? If you want to make a historian uncomfortable, do not ask them about dates. Ask them about patterns. Ask them to explain why the same shape appears on the walls of an Egyptian temple, in the private notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, and carved into a stone in rural Ireland, all separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, all with the same proportions, down to the millimeter. There is a form called the vesica piscis. It is made by drawing two circles of equal size so that the edge of each passes through the center of the other. Where they overlap, a shape is created, something like an eye or a leaf or a doorway. This form appears in the foundation geometry of Gothic cathedrals in France. It appears in the carved stone pools of Egyptian temples at Karnak. It appears in the sacred art of Buddhist monasteries in Tibet. It appears in the doorways of early Celtic stone churches in Ireland, predating the Christianity built around them by centuries. The ratio encoded inside this shape, the square root of 3, appears in the crystalline structure of metals and in the molecular bond angles of water. This is not decoration. The ancient builders were choosing shapes that corresponded to the proportions of physical reality at the molecular level. Proportions they could not have known by any method, our history records. Then there is the flower of life, a pattern of 17 overlapping circles, arranged in perfect hexagonal symmetry, contained within a larger circle. It appears carved into the granite at the Temple of Osiris at Abydos in Egypt, and the technique used to create it, according to materials scientists who have examined it, is one that no known ancient tool should have been able to produce. The lines are too precise. The surface shows no tool marks. It appears on the floor of the Forbidden City in Beijing. It appears in the oldest Sumerian tablets. It appears in the notebooks Leonardo kept in the last years of his life, where he returned to it again and again with an attention that suggests not casual interest, but obsession. The same shape, carved into a temple in Egypt, painted inside a cave in India, etched into a stone wall in Ireland, all before the year 3000 before the Common Era, all with the same proportions, down to the millimeter. No trade routes connected these places, and no records of any communication exist. So how did 3 civilizations on 3 different continents all dream the exact same dream? The Great Pyramid encodes the golden ratio, a specific mathematical relationship found throughout living systems, to a degree of precision that would require modern computational tools to achieve. The temple complex at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, when viewed from directly above and mapped precisely mirrors the constellation Draco exactly as it appeared in the night sky in 10,500 BCE, a date 12,000 years before the temple was built. Someone designed that building as a portrait of a sky no living person in their era had witnessed, and the same geometric proportions, the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, the specific angles of the Platonic solids, appear carved in stone, fired in clay, and painted on rock surfaces, in cultures that had no recorded contact across 40 centuries. What are the odds that this is coincidence? Statisticians who have actually calculated those odds have returned with numbers so small they function as a different kind of answer. And if it is not coincidence, if these patterns are appearing because someone intended them to, because this geometry was a language being spoken across time and distance, then the question changes completely. It is no longer, how did they build these structures? It becomes, what were they trying to say? Before going any further, it is worth pausing on a phrase, because the phrase itself has been contaminated. The words sacred geometry arrive loaded with baggage, crystals on windowsills, wellness retreat brochures, golden ratio coffee mugs, and 1,000 Instagram aesthetics that have wrapped these two words in so much soft, scented material that most educated people have learned to treat them as a signal to stop paying attention. This is, it turns out, precisely the kind of outcome that certain institutions have found useful. When the genuine thing and the superficial imitation share the same name, serious people learn to dismiss them together. So let us return to the original meaning, not the version that the wellness industry made popular, the version that caused the Pythagoreans to swear an oath of secrecy. In virtually every civilization that preceded our own Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Hindu, Mayan, Chinese, Celtic, Polynesian, the observation of geometric patterns in the natural world was not a hobby or a hobby dressed as religion. It was the primary science. It was practiced by the most educated members of society, protected with the kind of seriousness that modern governments reserve for weapons programs, and applied with a rigor that produced buildings still standing today after 4,000 years of weather, earthquake, and the steady pressure of time. The Pythagoreans, those Greek philosophers, we remember as the people who gave us a useful theorem about triangles, organized themselves around geometric discovery, the way we organize nuclear research. Behind closed doors, under oath, with the explicit understanding that what they were finding was dangerous. The Egyptian mystery schools, the inner orders of temple priests who supervised the design and construction of the great monuments, encoded geometric knowledge in their architectural commissions as a matter of deliberate policy. The Hindu Vastu Shastra tradition treated geometric proportion not as preference, but as law, with the understanding that incorrectly proportioned buildings harmed the people inside them, and correctly proportioned buildings healed them. The cathedral builders of medieval Europe worked in guilds whose inner knowledge was protected by penalties that made modern non-disclosure agreements look mild. These ancient practitioners were not worshipping geometry. They were observing it with the same systematic, repeatable attention that a physicist today applies in a laboratory. What they observed over centuries of watching shells grow and rivers bend, and seeds arrange themselves, and stars wheel across the sky, was that certain proportional relationships appeared consistently, and across every scale and in every living and cosmic system they could examine. Certain ratios were not occasional, they were everywhere. They behaved not like coincidences, but like laws. The Pythagoreans did not discover the golden ratio in a flash of inspiration. They observed it in bones, in flowers, in rivers, in the distances between planets. They were not mystics first and scientists second. They were scientists who kept arriving at findings so strange and so consistent that the findings began to feel like something more than observation, something like contact. And they were, by reliable historical account, genuinely frightened by where the numbers led. The working definition of sacred geometry, stripped of its modern residue, is this: the study of proportional relationships that appear consistently across living and cosmic systems, and the application of those relationships to human-made structures. Not because the proportions are beautiful, though they are, not because the priests demanded them, though they did, but because the builders had evidence accumulated over generations that structures built with these proportions did something that other structures did not. Something measurable, something real, something the buildings we live in today have largely forgotten how to do. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the most perfect shape you can, not a shape from a geometry textbook, a shape from a living thing, the curl of a wave just before it breaks, the spiral at the center of a sunflower, the slow widening coil of a shell built one chamber at a time over decades in deep water. These shapes do not come from human imagination, so they emerge from mathematical relationships so deep in the structure of physical reality that living systems across billions of years of evolution have independently arrived at the same forms, because these forms are optimal. Now go to the Temple of Osiris at Abydos in Egypt. Stand in a corridor whose location was hidden for 3,000 years before excavation revealed it. On the wall, carved at a height that a standing adult's eye naturally finds, you will see the flower of life. 17 interlocking circles in perfect hexagonal symmetry, contained within a larger circle. Material scientists who have studied the carving have noted in published form that the technique used does not correspond to any known ancient carving method. The surface shows characteristics more consistent with exposure to intense focused heat than with mechanical cutting. Whether this is significant or simply unexplained, the shape itself sits in Leonardo da Vinci's private notebooks, covered in mirror script annotations, returned to repeatedly in a way that suggests obsession. It sits on the floor of the Forbidden City in Beijing. It appears in the oldest surviving Sumerian tablets, pressed into clay more than 5,000 years ago. No trade route connected Abydos to Beijing, to Florence to Sumeria, in any era. The shape was not imported. It was found independently, repeatedly, by anyone who looked carefully at the way living things are organized in space. The Vesica Pisces is simpler, 2 circles of equal size, each passing through the other's center, creating, where they overlap, a form like an almond or a doorway. This form encodes the square root of 3 in its proportions. The square root of 3 appears in the structural equations of crystal lattices. It appears in the bond angles of water molecules. It appears in the foundations of Gothic cathedrals. in the sacred pools of Egyptian temples, and in the carved doorways of Celtic churches, whose site plans predate the Christianity that built walls around them. The Platonic solids deserve their own consideration. There are exactly 5 three-dimensional forms in which every face is identical, every edge the same length, every angle equal. 5 and only 5, as Euclid proved. Plato identified them and described each one as corresponding to a fundamental element of reality. They appear in the design of ancient temples, in the proportional systems of sacred structures worldwide, and in ornamental spheres found at archaeological sites in Scotland dating to 3,000 years before Christ. Today, the same 5 forms appear in the structure of certain viruses at the nanoscale, in the shape of certain molecules, and in the large-scale geometry of the observable universe, according to recent cosmological analysis. The dodecahedron, 12 pentagonal faces, each angle and each edge identical, describes both what Plato called the cosmos and what modern physics has tentatively assigned as the large-scale structure of the universe. Whether Plato arrived at this by genius, by tradition, or by access to knowledge that no longer exists in recorded form, the convergence is not a small thing. The same 6-petaled pattern appears in an Egyptian temple buried for 3,000 years, in Leonardo's private notebooks, and in the crystalline structure of ice under an electron microscope. No one made this up. It is simply there, waiting to be noticed. The ancient builders noticed it. They encoded it in stone as information, which raises the question the next section cannot avoid. Information about what? There is a word in ancient Egyptian that has no direct modern equivalent, per-nefer. It means roughly the perfect house, but perfect carried more weight then. It did not mean beautiful or grand or impressive. It meant correct, built according to proportions that bring the structure into alignment with the organizing principles of the living world. And the use of this word in ancient medical papyri is instructive. Patients suffering from chronic pain and what we might today call nervous exhaustion were prescribed time inside a per-nefer, not in a temple to pray, inside a specifically proportioned room for a specified number of days as a clinical intervention. The prescription specifies the room's dimensions, the width, the height, the ratio of one to the other, the orientation relative to the rising sun, the material of the floor. The builder who made a per-nefer was not a spiritual practitioner. He was an engineer following a specification the way a modern pharmacist follows a dosage. And the physician who prescribed it was not offering comfort or ceremony. He was offering geometry. This is not an isolated Egyptian peculiarity. The Hindu Vastu, Purusha, mandala, the geometric blueprint that governed the construction of temples, palaces, and homes across the Indian subcontinent, is based on an explicit premise that the human body and the built environment share the same proportional template, and that a building constructed in alignment with that template amplifies the health and clarity of the people inside. The mandala encodes the proportions of the human figure in the proportions of the structure, floor by floor, pillar by pillar. It is a design specification with a stated, functional intention. The Sufi masters of medieval Persia and Central Asia created architectural tilework of extraordinary geometric complexity. Patterns called giri, whose interlocking stars and hexagons create a specific visual field that practitioners described as inducing states of heightened perception and tranquil focus. Modern neuroscience has a vocabulary for what they were describing. The fractal, self-similar geometry of these tile patterns produces a measurable relaxation response in the human visual cortex. Reduced cortisol, improved heart rate variability, the kind of physiological settling that the body produces when it believes, at a deep level, that it is somewhere safe and correct. None of these cultures described these effects as supernatural. They described them as engineering, as the application of correct principles to physical materials, producing predictable and reproducible results. The difference between them and us is not that they were more spiritual, it is that they were more patient. They watched across generations what certain proportions did to people who lived and worked inside them. They built their conclusions into the structures themselves, which is why the structures still produce the same responses in the people who enter them now. What if these buildings were not temples, in the sense we use that word, places of worship and ceremony? What if they were something older and stranger, something our vocabulary does not have a clean category for? What if the geometry was not the decoration of the sacred, but the mechanism of it, the technology through which states of consciousness that the cultures valued were produced reliably and repeatedly in the bodies of the people inside the walls? The next chapter walks into those walls. It takes measurements, it reads the numbers, and the numbers, as it turns out, have been there all along. Let us begin with a number. The number is 51.52. It is the angle, measured in degrees, of the faces of the Great Pyramid of Giza, as they rise from the desert floor to the apex 480 feet above. Engineers who have studied this angle over the past 2 centuries have noted that it is not arbitrary. The cosine of 51.52 degrees is 0.618. The reciprocal of phi, the golden ratio, to 4 decimal places. Whoever chose this angle and embedded one of nature's most fundamental proportional constants in the silhouette of the most visited monument on Earth. Not approximately, precisely. This is one number among hundreds extracted from the pyramid through careful measurement. The perimeter of the base divided by twice the height gives pi to 4 decimal places, a mathematical constant not formally articulated in the Western tradition until 2,000 years after the pyramid was built, and the ratio of the pyramid's height to half its base perimeter equals the golden ratio. The entire structure is oriented to true north with an accuracy of 0.015 degrees, more precisely than the Greenwich Observatory in London at the time of its construction. There is no draft, there are no test structures. The first attempt produced a finished work that has not been equaled in 4,000 years. The logistics alone resist easy explanation. The pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. Some of the interior granite blocks weigh 80 tons. They were quarried 800 miles away in Aswan, transported by means that engineers still cannot fully reconstruct, and placed with a precision that modern surveyors, working with laser equipment, struggle to replicate. The outer casing stones, most of which are gone, she stripped in medieval times to build Cairo, were fitted together with joints so fine that a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. The conventional explanation, ramps, sledges, 100,000 workers over 20 years, has been carefully examined by structural engineers who have noted an inconvenient mathematical reality. A ramp long enough to maintain a workable gradient for hauling 80-ton blocks to the upper levels would need to be longer than the pyramid itself, and would require more material to construct than the pyramid contains. This does not mean the ramp theory is impossible. It means the ramp theory, as typically described, does not add up. And when the numbers do not add up, the honest response is not to change the subject. The Great Pyramid was not built by people who did not understand what they were doing. It was built by people who understood it so thoroughly that the understanding has been encoded in the structure at every scale, in the angle of the face, in the ratio of the dimensions, in the alignment to the cardinal points, in the specific properties of the stone chosen for the specific chambers within. Someone knew exactly what they were building. The pyramid is not a monument to a dead king. It is a message written in the one medium that can survive long enough to be read. Stone, shaped by mathematics, aimed at the future. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd walking the hills of southeastern Turkey noticed something protruding from the soil. He told an archaeologist. The archaeologist began to excavate. What emerged over the next 2 decades rewrote the timeline of human civilization so thoroughly that the word rewrote does not quite contain the scope of the revision. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of circular stone enclosures on a hilltop in what is now Turkey, dating to approximately 11,600 years ago. To understand why this date is extraordinary, consider the sequence that every school history follows. Hunter-gatherers roamed the earth. Then, around 10,000 years ago, agriculture was invented. Then, with agriculture came settlements. Then, with settlements came surplus. Then, with surplus came specialization. Then, with specialization, came the social organization capable of building monuments. Göbekli Tepe was built before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before cities, before writing, before pottery in the region, before, according to the standard timeline, the kind of society existed that could have organized the labor required to build it. The T-shaped limestone pillars that dominate the site stand up to 6 meters tall and weigh as much as 20 tons. They are carved with relief sculptures of extraordinary skill. Foxes, boars, cranes, lions, serpents, abstract symbols, executed with a precision and confidence that no beginner's hand produces. The pillars are arranged in perfect circles, and when researchers measured the angular relationships between them, the ratios that emerged were not random. The golden ratio appears in the spacing. Specific astronomical alignments have been documented. The layout of the pillars encodes, as a star map, the position of specific constellations at specific dates. One of those dates corresponds to an event now documented in the geological record. An event so significant that it ended the previous geological epoch. The site covers at least 22 acres. Archaeologists estimate that less than 5% of it has been excavated. And here is the detail that stops people mid-sentence. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. At some point, the people who built it filled the entire complex with tons of earth and rubble, with apparent intentionality, and left. No settlement debris has been found, no hearths, no sleeping areas, no food preparation areas. The people who built the most complex ceremonial site in the known prehistoric world did not live there. They came, they built, and they gathered for purposes we do not understand, and then they buried their work under the earth as carefully as they had constructed it. It was built by hunter-gatherers, people who, according to every standard account, had not yet invented the wheel or discovered how to grow grain, and yet its stones weigh 20 tons, and its geometry encodes astronomical knowledge that is, by any measure, sophisticated. Someone forgot to tell these people what they were not supposed to know how to do, or, the more careful and more troubling consideration, someone taught them. There is a place in Cambodia where the jungle grows around a city of temples, and the temples are so large that the jungle, for all its patience and persistence, has never quite won. Angkor Wat covers approximately 400 acres, the largest religious monument ever constructed by human hands. 12 centuries after its completion, it still stands. But the size is not the mystery. The mystery is what it was designed to say and when. The proportional system of Angkor Wat is one of the most precisely documented in the ancient world. Researchers working with laser measuring equipment have confirmed that the distances between its towers, the dimensions of its galleries, and the relationships between its axial alignments encode, with a precision within 1%, the periods of the lunar calendar, the length of the solar year, and the cycle of the precession of the equinoxes. The slow wobble of the Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete one full turn. The builders of Angkor Wat knew this cycle. They built it into the stone. To know the precession cycle requires either centuries of careful observation or access to records spanning those centuries, records accumulated by a tradition of observation whose age would dwarf that of the temple itself. The most stunning revelation came not from measurement of the structure itself, but from computer simulation of the night sky. When researchers mapped the angular relationships between the 5 principal towers and set an astronomical program running backward through the centuries, they found an exact match. The towers of Angkor Wat trace the stars of the Draco constellation, not as they appear today, not as they appeared in the 12th century CE when the temple was built, but as they appeared in approximately 10,500 BCE. The builders were not creating a map of their sky, nor they were creating a map of a sky that no one alive in their era had ever seen, that no human eye on record had observed for more than 11,000 years. Computer simulation of the night sky confirms it. Seen from directly above, the towers of Angkor Wat trace the stars of Draco exactly as they appeared 12,500 years ago. A building constructed in the 12th century was designed as a portrait of a sky that no one in that era had ever witnessed. Whoever designed it was working from a record, astronomical and geometric, of extraordinary age and extraordinary continuity. What Angkor Wat shares with the pyramids at Giza is not just the astronomical target, it is the date. Both structures encode in their celestial alignments the same period, the era around 10,500 BCE. 2 civilizations, on opposite sides of the world, left architectural monuments pointing toward the same moment in the deep past. What happened then, what they were commemorating, what they were recording, is what the next chapters begin to address. For now, what matters is this. The builders of Angkor Wat were not building for their century. They were building for someone who would come later, with the instruments to read what the stone said. They appear to have been building, in other words, for us. Before we speak of Stonehenge as we see it today, the famous ring of standing stones on the Salisbury Plain, half fallen, visited by millions, it is worth describing what a researcher heard when she played a drumbeat inside a full acoustic reconstruction of the original, complete structure. The sound went out. It filled the stone circle, and what came back from the inner face of the stones was an echo pattern she recognized. She had heard it once before in a recording made inside the grand gallery of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Separated by 2,000 miles of distance and 1,000 years of construction history, these two structures produce the same acoustic signature, the same room in the language of sound. Stonehenge was not built in a season, or a generation, or a century. Its construction spans approximately 1,500 years, from roughly 3000 BCE to around 1500 BCE, with multiple phases of building, modification, and addition by successive generations of people who shared no common language, no common political authority, and no surviving written tradition. And yet each phase of construction was consistent with the others, as though every generation of builders was working from the same template, inherited but never written down, passed forward the way the shapes themselves were passed forward, through the practice of those who understood them. The visible stone circle is only part of the picture. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Stonehenge landscape, conducted between 2010 and 2020, revealed an underground world of extraordinary complexity. Pits, chambers, aligned earthworks, and geometric formations extending for miles beyond the visible monument. These features, hidden underground for 5,000 years, were laid out according to geometric principles consistent with the surface structures. Someone designed this landscape as a unified system at a scale that required not years of planning, but generations. The bluestones deserve special attention. These smaller stones, the inner ring of Stonehenge, were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, a distance of nearly 300 miles, across rivers and uplands and open water. Geologically identical stone was available within a mile of the Stonehenge site. The builders made a 300-mile journey across difficult terrain for a specific stone. In 2018, acoustic researchers found the reason the Welsh bluestones ring, strike them, and they produce a clear resonant tone. The local stones are acoustically dead. The builders of Stonehenge were not choosing a building material. They were choosing a musical instrument, and they went 300 miles to find the right one. A complete digital reconstruction of Stonehenge was built in a laboratory, and a sound was played at its center. The echo pattern that returned matched, almost exactly, the echo recorded inside the grand gallery of the Great Pyramid. Separated by 2,000 miles and 1,000 years of construction, and they sound like the same room. This is not coincidence. This is design. The invisible architect who wrote the blueprint for both structures had very specific ideas. about what these buildings needed to do. The next chapter begins to decode what that is. There is a number that exists in the space between mathematics and biology, between the abstract and the alive. It is not a large number. It sits just above 1.5. Its decimal expansion never repeats, never terminates, goes on forever without pattern or pause. It is approximately 1.618. Ancient mathematicians called it the divine proportion. Later thinkers called it the golden ratio. Mathematicians call it phi. And for all the grandeur of these names, the strangest thing about it is not what humans have called it. It is where it keeps appearing without being called at all. Think of the most beautiful face you have ever seen. A film star, a painting, a person you passed once in a crowd and found yourself turning to watch. The reason that face registers as beautiful, not culturally beautiful, not fashionably beautiful, but beautiful in the deep way that bypasses opinion, is in significant part measurable. The ratio of the width of the face to the width of the nose, the distance from the pupils to the tip of the chin, and the height of the forehead relative to the length from the eyebrows to the lips. When these ratios approach 1.618, the human visual system produces a specific response: recognition, harmony, rightness. Cross-cultural studies have confirmed this response in populations with no shared aesthetic tradition. It is not something taught, it is something observed from inside by every human nervous system that has ever formed. Now look at the shell of a nautilus. It grows in a logarithmic spiral, each new chamber larger than the last by a consistent ratio. That ratio is phi. The seeds of a sunflower head arrange themselves in 2 interlocking sets of spirals, one clockwise and one counterclockwise. The number of spirals in each direction is always a consecutive pair from the Fibonacci sequence. Numbers whose ratio, as the sequence extends, it converges toward phi. The branching of trees follows phi ratios in species after species. The proportions of the human skeleton, the distribution of leaves around a stem, the architecture of the inner ear, the orbital periods of Venus as it traces its 5-year cycle against the stars. In 2010, a team of physicists studying the quantum mechanical behavior of electrons in magnetic fields, work that has nothing to do with shells or ancient architecture, found that the scaling factor governing their results was the golden ratio. Exactly. They described their results as quantum critical. Phi was not a tool they had brought to the experiment. It emerged from the data like a guest who had always been there. Phi is not a human invention. It predates humanity by billions of years. It appears in the structure of atoms and in the shape of galaxies. It appears in the proportions of the human heart and in the orbit of planets. And it appears carved in stone with copper tools in the angle of a pyramid's face built 4,000 years ago to a precision that requires modern computational tools to verify. The ancient builders who encoded phi in their structures were not performing a symbolic gesture. They were doing what every serious observer of nature eventually does, following the number wherever it went. And the number went, it seems, directly through the walls of their most important buildings, because they had reason to believe that a structure built in phi's proportions was not just beautiful, it was functional in a way that other structures were not. The question is, functional how? The next sections begin to answer this, and the answer comes not from architecture, but from physics. There is a thought experiment worth pausing on. Imagine you want to encode the value of pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, in a physical structure without writing the number down. You have no Arabic numerals, no algebraic notation, no papyrus that will survive the millennia. You have stone, you have rope, you have the sky. How do you do it? The answer, as the builders of the Great Pyramid appear to have understood, is that you do not encode pi, you build it. If you construct a circular object with a diameter of 1 unit and measure its circumference, you get pi, not as a calculation, but as a physical reality. Pi is not a number that has to be written to be used. It is a property of circles, which means it is a property of any structure that incorporates circular geometry into its design. The ancient builders did not need to know that pi equals 3.14159 to encode that value in their proportional system. They needed only to know how to draw a circle, and then to allow that circle to govern the relationships between the dimensions of their structure. The number emerged from the geometry the way heat emerges from fire. Not chosen, produced. This understanding transforms the anomaly of pi in the Great Pyramid from a mystery into an explanation. The pyramid does not contain pi because someone calculated it. It contains pi because the design was derived from circular, geometric operations. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its radius expressed in the ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height. And the builders were performing the operations of sacred geometry, constructing forms according to proportional systems derived from natural observation, and pi was one of the constants that these operations naturally produced. The same principle applies to the Fibonacci sequence. The sequence begins with 1 and 1, then adds each pair to produce the next. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55. The ratio between any two consecutive numbers in this sequence approaches the golden ratio as the numbers grow. And ancient builders use this as a practical constructional code. Build a structure whose dimensions follow Fibonacci ratios, whose height is to its width as 8 is to 5, or as 13 is to 8, and you automatically produce a building whose proportions approach phi throughout, and without needing to calculate phi explicitly. The Fibonacci sequence is a builder's shorthand for the golden ratio, a way of producing divine proportion with integer measurements that any craftsperson can work with directly in stone or wood. They did not write pi, they built it. Every circle, every arc, every curve in these ancient structures contains pi, not because someone calculated it, but because physical reality contains it. And these builders were paying close enough attention to let reality speak through their constructions. This distinction matters enormously because it reveals what kind of knowledge these builders had. They were not mathematicians in the academic sense. They were geometers in the original sense, measurers of the earth, who understood that certain operations on physical reality produce certain constants, and that constructing buildings according to those constants produced buildings that behaved differently from others. The mathematics was not abstract. It was embedded in the practice, and the practice transmitted across generations through the secret traditions of builder guilds produced structures still standing today, while everything else from their era has dissolved into soil. Pythagoras said, "All is number." We remember this as a philosophical statement, the kind of thing a Greek philosopher says, dramatic and vague. But the people who recorded it did not experience it as vague. They recorded it as the distillation of a program of inquiry, so rigorous and so demanding of proof that Pythagoras' followers swore binding oaths before they were permitted to hear what he had found. All is number was not a metaphor. It was a conclusion, arrived at through decades of systematic observation, supported by evidence that the Pythagoreans, in their secrecy and their awe, considered too important to risk mishandling. What they had found was this: every phenomenon they could measure was governed by mathematical ratio. The intervals of musical harmony corresponded to specific ratios of string length, ratios that the ear recognized as beautiful and that mathematics confirmed as simple fractions. The movement of celestial bodies followed proportional patterns that could be predicted and verified. The proportions of the human body expressed relationships that appeared in the natural world at every scale. Mathematics was not a tool that humans applied to reality. It was the structure of reality, visible wherever anyone with patience and precision chose to look. This belief, and the evidence behind it, shaped the way every subsequent ancient civilization thought about the built environment. If number is structural, then a building constructed according to correct ratios participates in the structure of the world in a way that an incorrectly proportioned building does not. It resonates with the mathematics that governs living systems and celestial orbits. And if it resonates with that mathematics, this was the ancient reasoning, then it will do to people what the natural world does when its proportions are right. It will produce the sense of being inside something larger and more organized than the individual self, the sense the ancients called sacred. The Kabbalistic tradition encoded the proportions of the tree of life, its 10 nodes and 22 pathways, in a geometric structure whose relationships map, according to researchers at Hebrew University who have published on the subject, to the proportions of the human nervous system and to the Fibonacci ratios simultaneously. The Hindu chakra system, when rendered geometrically, produces the same nested proportional relationships that appear in the human body and in the design of Vedic temples. The Islamic geometric art tradition, the Giri tile work that covers the walls of mosques from Spain to Central Asia, encodes mathematical relationships that Western mathematics did not formally describe until the latter half of the 20th century. These traditions did not treat mathematics as a spiritual metaphor. They treated it as a spiritual instrument, a precise tool for producing, in physical form, the conditions in which human beings experienced what they called the divine, and what modern neuroscience is beginning to identify as measurable states of heightened integration between the brain's functional networks. The language has changed entirely. The phenomenon has not moved at all. Pythagoras was not writing poetry. He was writing physics. And every structure in this documentary is a physical argument that he was right. There is a passage in Ireland, built from stone before the pyramids existed, that does something no modern building does. When you enter it, a low tunnel of carefully placed slabs leading to a central chamber. The sound of the world outside disappears not gradually, but all at once like a door closing. And then the chamber sound begins, a low, almost imperceptible resonance, present in the air the way that electricity is present in a wire. People who have entered this chamber, called Newgrange and approximately 5,200 years old, describe a consistent experience, their thoughts slow. The boundary between what is inside them and what is outside seems to soften. They do not want to speak, not because speaking is forbidden, but because the quality of the silence seems more substantial than any word. Acoustic archaeologists who have recorded inside Newgrange have found a specific cause for this experience. The chamber resonates most powerfully at a frequency of approximately 111 Hz. This is not the most common resonant frequency of natural rock formations. It is, however, the low end of the male vocal range. Specifically, are the frequency produced by sustained, low-pitched chanting. And in neuroscience research, exposure to sustained sound environments in the 110 to 111 Hz range has been documented to do something measurable to the human brain. Activity in the prefrontal cortex, the seat of analytical, logical thought, decreases. Activity in the regions associated with spatial awareness, emotional depth, and the integration of sensory experience increases. Subjects describe a state they call remarkably consistently across different cultural backgrounds, presence, the sense of being fully, almost overwhelmingly, somewhere. This finding has been replicated across dozens of ancient ceremonial sites on multiple continents by independent research teams working without knowledge of each other's results. At the Hal Saflieni Hypodrome in Malta, an underground temple complex carved from living rock around 3,600 BCE, produces the same resonance frequency and the same quality of acoustic immersion. So does the Chavin de Huanta temple in the high Andes of Peru. So do chambers in Turkey, in Scotland, in the American Southwest. The consistency is not accidental. These chambers were built to this specific frequency with the engineering precision that building to a specific frequency requires. Researchers played a drumbeat inside Newgrange and measured what came back. The chamber resonated at 111 Hz, the exact frequency that neuroscience research conducted 4,000 years later identifies as suppressing the logical mind and amplifying the sense of presence. The people who built this room knew what sound would do to the people inside it. They built the effect into the stone the way a concert hall designer builds acoustics into a ceiling. The difference is that concert hall designers optimize for clarity of musical performance. The builders of Newgrange were optimizing for something older, and from the evidence, considerably more ambitious. Among all ancient sites whose acoustic properties have been studied, Stonehenge occupies a singular position, not because its acoustics are the most dramatic, but because its acoustic research is the most rigorously documented in the scientific record. The researchers who did the work were not fringe theorists. They were Dr. Rupert Till of the University of Huddersfield and Dr. Bruno Fazenda of the University of Salford, and they published their findings in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. Their method was meticulous. Unable to test within the actual stones, they built a scaled acoustic model of the original, complete Stonehenge structure and applied a technique called convolution, to produce a virtual acoustic profile of the building, as it would have sounded when all the stones were standing. What the model produced was striking. Stonehenge, in its complete form, would have generated a strong, distinctive echo with a specific character of acoustic immersion, a quality that Till and Fazenda described as the sense of being enclosed, surrounded by sound, inside rather than outside. Sounds played in the center of the circle would return from the inner faces of the stones in a complex, layered pattern that creates, in the listener, an experience qualitatively different from sound in open air or in a standard enclosed room. And the researchers did not speculate about purpose. They described what the structure did, measured and confirmed. Then there are the blue stones, the smaller, inner ring of stones whose transportation from Wales represents one of the great unexplained acts of logistical determination in all of prehistory. The prevailing explanation for why these stones were brought from 300 miles away has always been vaguely cultural. Perhaps the Welsh stones had religious significance. It is a satisfying explanation if you do not look at it closely. In 2018, acoustic geologist Dr. Alistair Pike published research noting that the Preseli bluestones ring when struck. Their crystalline structure produces a clear, bell-like tone. The local stones at Stonehenge are acoustically inert, structurally sound but tonally dead. The builders made a journey of 300 miles across difficult terrain to obtain the right sound. They were not choosing a building material, they were choosing a musical instrument. And they chose their materials with the same selectivity a luthier brings to choosing wood. For resonance, for tone, for the specific quality of what the stone does when vibration moves through it. The bluestones were carried from Wales nearly 300 miles, when identical-looking stone was available a mile away. Acoustic researchers discovered why. The Welsh stones ring like a bell. Someone, 4,000 years ago, went 300 miles to get the right sound. That is not the behavior of a people building arbitrarily. That is the behavior of specialists working to an acoustic specification. The body is, in very large part, water. The nervous system is a network of electrochemical signals. The brain is a field of oscillating electromagnetic frequencies, constantly shifting between states that correspond to different qualities of consciousness. These are measured, physical phenomena. And the question ancient builders appear to have been asking, with more sophistication than we have, until recently, been willing to credit, is whether specific acoustic environments could influence these physical states in useful, predictable, and reproducible ways. The short answer, based on contemporary research, is yes. The field of therapeutic acoustics, the use of specific sound frequencies for physiological and neurological benefit, is no longer fringe science. It is practiced in hospitals and research institutions across Europe, Japan, and North America, are in low-frequency sound in the range produced by ancient ceremonial chambers has been shown in controlled studies to reduce blood pressure, lower cortisol levels, slow heart rate, and shift brainwave activity from the beta range associated with active analytical thought to the alpha range associated with calm, receptive awareness. These effects are not produced by music in the conventional sense, melody, rhythm, harmony. They are produced by sustained tones at specific frequencies, by exactly the kind of sound environment that ancient ceremonial chambers were engineered to create. The connection to infrasound, sound frequencies below the threshold of conscious human hearing, adds another layer. In ancient ceremonial chambers, built with specific proportions and materials, produce infrasound as a natural acoustic byproduct of their construction. Infrasound is felt rather than heard. It creates a physical pressure in the chest and abdomen. In research conducted over the past 2 decades, exposure to infrasound in specific frequency ranges has been documented to produce a striking range of effects: heightened emotional sensitivity, visual disturbances, a sense of being watched or accompanied by an unseen presence, and in some subjects, experiences that they consistently describe in the vocabulary of religious or mystical encounter. This last category has been reproduced in laboratory settings, not as a religious experience but as a neurological event. The ancient builders of these chambers, who deliberately constructed the acoustic conditions that produce it, were apparently aware that the chambers had this effect. They called it by different names in different cultures. Egyptian texts speak of the presence of the neta. Celtic records speak of the thinning of the veil between worlds. Every ancient ceremonial chamber resonates with infrasound at specific frequencies, and those frequencies trigger in the human nervous system a state that ancient texts describe as the presence of the divine. These architects did not build places to think about God. They built places to feel God, with physics. The question this raises is not theological, it is technical. What else did they know, and how long had they known it? By the time you have walked through the evidence, the acoustic engineering, the precise frequency tuning, in the material selection for specific sonic properties, the geometric forms that produce measurable neurological responses, a hypothesis begins to form that is not mystical, but is, in some ways, stranger than mysticism. What if these buildings were not places of worship in the sense we use that word? What if they were environments engineered to produce specific states in the human beings who entered them, as reliably and precisely as a pharmaceutical produces specific states in the body? This is not speculation. It is the synthesis of converging evidence from multiple independent fields. The geometry creates acoustic resonance. The acoustic resonance shifts brainwave activity. The fractal visual patterns produce measurable relaxation responses in the visual cortex. The orientation of the structure, its alignment to solstice sunrises, to specific star positions, means that at particular moments in the year, specific qualities of light enter the chamber in specific ways, creating visual experiences that neuroscience associates with altered states of attention. The ritual practices described in ancient texts, sustained chanting, drumming at specific rhythms, sensory restriction in darkness, are exactly the practices that contemporary neuroscience has identified as capable of producing the deepest shifts in conscious state. Everything was coordinated. Every element reinforced the others. And then there is the granite. Granite, under mechanical pressure, generates an electromagnetic field, a phenomenon called piezoelectricity. Documented in materials science for more than a century, and the Great Pyramid contains millions of tons of granite under the continuous pressure of its own weight. The king's chamber, which sits at the center of this granite under pressure system, has been measured to contain an electromagnetic field anomaly, a reading that does not match the surrounding environment and cannot be fully accounted for by the geological context. In 2012, neuroscientist Dr. Michael Persinger published research demonstrating that the human brain, when exposed to a specific magnetic field pattern, produces experiences that subjects describe as indistinguishable from religious or mystical states. The sense of presence, of connection, of the self expanding beyond its usual boundaries. Granite under pressure generates an electromagnetic field. The Great Pyramid contains millions of tons of granite under the pressure of its own weight. The King's Chamber has been measured to contain an unusual electromagnetic field, and that field, according to neurological research, produces in human subjects what religious texts call mystical experience. The engineers who chose granite for the inner chamber, who shaped it with such precision, who built its proportions according to the mathematical constants of the natural world, they knew exactly what they were building. Not a tomb, not a monument, a machine for altering the state of the human mind. This is not the most comfortable conclusion, but it is the one that the evidence patiently and from multiple directions continues to point toward. The phrase ley line has a problem, and the problem is not the thing the phrase describes. The problem is the history of who has used it and why. When Alfred Watkins, a Herefordshire businessman and amateur archaeologist, published his observations about straight alignments of ancient sites across the British landscape in 1921, he was describing a genuine geometric puzzle with the honest curiosity of an amateur. The idea was quickly adopted by spiritualist movements, who filled it with content that had nothing to do with Watkins's original observation. Within a generation, ley lines had become a vehicle for every kind of untestable metaphysical assertion, and the legitimate geometric question at the center of Watkins's work had been buried under accumulated mysticism. What Watkins actually noticed was this: when you plot the positions of ancient sites, standing stones, hill forts, ancient crossroads, old churches built on even older sacred ground, on a large-scale map, they tend to align, not every site with every other site, and not with perfect precision in every case, but in patterns that are difficult to attribute to chance when analyzed statistically. Watkins had no statistical tools. He had maps and a good eye. The statistical tools came later, and what they found was harder to dismiss. Researcher John Michel spent decades applying rigorous geometric analysis to the positions of ancient sites across the British Isles. Using surveying data refined to modern GPS precision, he documented geometric patterns, equilateral triangles, regular hexagons, pentagrams, whose vertices coincide with the positions of prehistoric monuments. The accuracy of these patterns, measured over distances of up to 50 miles, is within tens of meters. When researchers at the University of Arizona applied Monte Carlo statistical simulation to the question of whether these alignments could occur by chance, a technique that generates millions of random configurations and measures how often random placement produces patterns as regular as the observed ones, the probability of chance generating the documented pattern was calculated at less than 1 in 10,000. This is not mysticism. This is a p-value, and scientists take p-values very seriously. The pattern extends beyond Britain. When the positions of major ancient sacred sites worldwide are plotted on a globe, Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid, Angkor Wat, Easter Island, the Nazca Lines, Chichen Itza, the lines connecting them are not random. The sites fall on great circles, and the angular relationships between them encode specific mathematical ratios. The probability analysis has been performed independently by multiple research groups and consistently returns the same result. The placement of these sites cannot be adequately explained by independent local decisions. Something coordinated their position, something that had knowledge of the Earth's geometry, the precise positions of distant locations, and the mathematical relationships that the resulting network would encode. Plot Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid, Angkor Wat, Easter Island, Nazca, and Chichen Itza on a globe and draw the lines that connect them. You will find a geometric pattern whose precision no coincidence can account for. A pattern that implies not separate cultures building separately, but a single intelligence building according to a single plan. What that intelligence was, where it came from, and why it chose these particular locations. These are the questions the next section begins to answer. There is a concept in astronomy called the precession of the equinoxes. It is the slow wobble of the Earth's rotational axis, a motion so gradual that it completes one full cycle in approximately 25,920 years. Because of this wobble, the constellation visible on the eastern horizon at sunrise on the spring equinox changes slowly over the millennia, moving through the 12 signs of the zodiac in a cycle that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. To calculate this cycle with precision requires either observational records spanning centuries or an understanding of celestial mechanics, sophisticated enough to predict it from shorter observations. The Hindu Yuga cycle describes an age of the world lasting 25,920 years. The Mayan long count calendar describes a great cycle within rounding distance of the same number. The ancient Greek concept of the great year, the time required for the sky to return to exactly the same configuration, is given as 25,920 years. These three cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, arrived at the same number for a phenomenon that requires either sustained multi-century astronomical observation or a mathematical tradition of extraordinary sophistication. The convergence on the same number, independently in three unconnected traditions, is the kind of data point that statistics was invented to evaluate. The Great Sphinx at Giza faces due east toward the rising sun on the equinoxes. In the current era, on the spring equinox, the Sphinx looks toward Taurus on the horizon. 12,000 years ago, in 10,500 BCE, the spring equinox horizon showed Leo. The Sphinx is a lion. Its face looks toward the exact point on the horizon where the Leo constellation rose on the spring equinox of 10,500 BCE. Someone built a lion facing the place where the lion constellation rose 12,000 years ago. Then other people, thousands of years later, built the pyramid complex around it, maintaining the astronomical alignment with a precision that required knowledge of the precession cycle to sustain. On three different continents, in structures built by cultures that had no recorded contact in the same date is encoded in the alignment of the stones, 10,500 BCE. That is the date, according to geological evidence, now entering the mainstream scientific record, when an event of catastrophic scale changed the face of the Earth. A meteoritic impact over Greenland, documented in a 2018 Nature paper. A cosmic airburst over the Levant, documented in a separate 2018 publication. The onset of the Younger Dryas, a sudden severe climate disruption that lasted 1,200 years. Someone survived that event. Someone remembered it, and they built monuments pointing to it across the surface of the Earth, using a geometric and astronomical knowledge that implies, quietly, insistently, that what was destroyed when the world changed was not a simple collection of hunter-gatherer bands. It was a civilization. And the monuments are its message in a bottle. When confronted with evidence of this kind, the global geometric pattern, the astronomical alignments pointing to the same deep time date, the shared mathematical constants encoded in structures on every continent, two explanations present themselves. The first is that a single advanced civilization, existing before our recorded history, developed and disseminated this knowledge before being destroyed by a catastrophic event. The second is that the same constants keep appearing because they are properties of the natural world, independently discoverable by any culture patient and systematic enough to observe carefully. The honest response is not to commit entirely to either before examining both. The second explanation, independent discovery, has the advantage of parsimony. It does not require a missing civilization. It requires only that human beings, everywhere, observing the same natural world, find the same patterns. This is true and significant. The golden ratio does emerge from nature. Pi does emerge from circles. Fibonacci ratios appear in growth patterns observable on every continent. Civilizations that watch nature carefully would find these constants. The explanation works. Where it begins to strain is at the level of precision. Independent discovery of the golden ratio does not explain why the layout of the Giza pyramid complex and the layout of Angkor Wat both encode the same specific celestial configuration from the same specific date on opposite sides of the planet. It does not explain why the acoustic chambers of prehistoric Ireland, the Andean highlands, sea in Turkey all resonate at the same specific frequency. It does not explain why the global network of ancient sacred sites forms geometric patterns accurate to tens of meters over distances of 50 miles. These are not the kinds of patterns that emerge from independent observation of the same natural phenomena. They are the kinds of patterns that emerge from a shared template. Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University has published geological analysis, arguing that the weathering pattern on the Great Sphinx, deep vertical channels consistent with prolonged rainfall erosion, indicates a construction date of at least 7,000 BCE. The Sphinx would then be not 4,000 years old, but 9,000 years old at minimum. His analysis has never been formally refuted on geological grounds. Indeed, it has been dismissed on the grounds that accepting it would require revising the archaeological timeline too substantially. 200 feet below the surface of the ocean, off the coast of India, lie the remains of a submerged structure, carbon dated at approximately 9,500 years old, extending across several acres in a pattern consistent with planned construction. During the last glacial maximum, this area was dry land. The people who built there were erased not by war or disease, but by the sea, which rose as the glaciers melted and covered the evidence of their existence under 200 feet of water. We do not know what they knew. We only know they were there, and that something erased them, and that the people who came after them built their most enduring structures with a geometry that points across 12,000 years, back to the moment when the sea rose and the world changed. We have a story we tell ourselves about lost knowledge. It involves a library in Egypt, the most famous repository of ancient learning ever assembled, and a fire. The Library of Alexandria is our explanatory convenience, the single catastrophic event that accounts for the gap between what the ancient world apparently knew and what survived into the modern era. It is a satisfying story. It is also, in important ways, a misleading one, not because the library did not exist, or because its destruction did not matter, but because it has trained us to imagine that lost knowledge was lost in a single moment, in a single place, by a single act of fire. The reality was slower, quieter, and far more thorough. In 637 CE, an Arab armies sacked the great library of the Persian capital at Ctesiphon. By one account, the books found there, thousands of volumes of Persian, Greek, and Indian philosophy, mathematics, and natural science, were thrown into the Tigris River on the grounds that anything not contained in the Quran was either redundant or dangerous. In 1562, in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Spanish Franciscan friar, Diego de Landa, supervised the burning of every Mayan manuscript he could locate. 40 codices were destroyed in a single afternoon. De Landa later acknowledged in his own written account that the Mayans wept as they watched. He burned the books anyway, in the service of God. And historians estimate that what he destroyed in those hours represented most of the surviving written record of one of the most mathematically sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. The burning of Alexandria is a story we were given to explain why we do not know what the ancients knew. But Alexandria burned once. The real destruction was slower, quieter, and it happened in universities and churches and royal courts over centuries, carried out by people who were absolutely certain they were improving on what they erased. What makes this history particularly relevant is the nature of what was most consistently targeted. Not practical knowledge, engineering, agriculture, medicine, but interpretive knowledge, the understanding of why the mathematics worked, the traditions that connected the measurement of a shell's spiral to the design of a sacred chamber, to the theory of consciousness, to the structure of the cosmos. This connective tissue, the knowledge that explained what the numbers meant, was precisely what the various acts of destruction were most efficient at removing. The numbers survived, encoded in the stones that could not be burned. The understanding of the numbers survived only in fragments, transmitted in secret, preserved in forms designed to survive scrutiny. Every medium in which knowledge can be stored has a lifespan. Papyrus decays, clay tablets shatter, hard drives corrode. The only information storage system that reliably persists across geological timescales is stone shaped with precision, oriented to the sky. The builders of these structures understood this, and they were not building for posterity in the way we mean the word, for their grandchildren or their legacy. They were building for the long silence that comes after catastrophe and for whoever would emerge from it. There is a difference between knowledge that is lost and knowledge that is hidden. The first is a tragedy of circumstance. The second is a choice, a decision made by people with power that certain understanding should not be generally available. The history of sacred geometric knowledge is, in significant part, a history of the second kind of loss. Not the fire that consumes everything, but the vault that preserves it for the few. The Pythagorean Brotherhood was not a philosophical discussion group. It was an initiatory order with explicit rules about what could be shared outside its membership. The inner teachings, the geometric and mathematical discoveries that Pythagoras and his students considered most important, were never written down by policy. They were transmitted mouth to ear, under oath, to those who had undergone sufficient preparation. The mathematician Hippasus is said to have been expelled from the Brotherhood, some accounts say killed, for revealing to outsiders a mathematical discovery the inner circle had classified: the existence of irrational numbers, numbers whose decimal expansion never terminates and never repeats, numbers that break the clean, rational universe the Pythagoreans had hoped to be living in. The secret was kept not because the knowledge was wrong, but because the knowledge was dangerous to a world view, to a cosmology, to the social order that world view sustained. In the stonemason guilds of medieval Europe were the direct inheritors of this tradition of protected geometric knowledge. They built the great Gothic cathedrals, Notre Dame, Chartres, Salisbury, Cologne, according to geometric templates of extraordinary sophistication, transmitted through their guild traditions from sources they acknowledged as ancient. The geometry they used, the specific proportional systems, the acoustic design principles, the relationship between the building's form and its effect on the people inside, was classified as trade secret. Guild members swore oaths of secrecy on admission. The penalties for disclosure were real. The stonemason guilds of medieval Europe were the last inheritors of an unbroken geometric tradition stretching back to Egypt. They built cathedrals that would outlast every institution that commissioned them, and they carried their knowledge in silence, under oaths of secrecy, because they understood that some knowledge in the wrong political climate is a death sentence. What makes this history particularly devastating is the relationship between these guilds and the Catholic Church that commissioned their work. The Church used the geometry. The cathedrals are the proof, the most sophisticated application of sacred geometric principles in the medieval world, designed with acoustic properties that produce the specific neurological responses described in the previous chapter. The Church knew exactly why the buildings worked, and the Church also formally prohibited as heresy any explicit philosophical discussion of these same geometric principles. The geometry was used but not explained. The experience was produced but not analyzed. People were permitted to feel the sacred. They were not permitted to understand the mechanism. Understanding the mechanism was a privilege reserved for those who built the buildings. Despite everything, Despite the fires and the prohibitions, and the centuries of careful institutional forgetting, the knowledge did not disappear entirely. It went underground. It disguised itself. It encoded itself in forms that could pass unnoticed through centuries of hostile scrutiny, waiting for someone with the right preparation to read what had been written between the lines. Leonardo da Vinci was not merely the most talented artist of the Renaissance. He was a man possessed by a specific investigation, one that consumed him for his entire adult life and left behind, in the private notebooks he wrote in mirror script and shared with almost no one, the evidence of someone who had found the thread and could not let go of it. The flower of life fills page after page of the Codex Atlanticus. The golden ratio governs the compositional geometry of the Last Supper and the structural analysis of the Vitruvian Man. His anatomical drawings encode phi in the proportions of the human body with a precision that reads as measurement, not aesthetic preference. Leonardo was not decorating with these relationships. He was investigating them, arriving at the same suspicion that the ancient temple builders had acted on, that these numbers were not incidental to the structure of reality, but constitutive of it. The Rosicrucian manifestos that circulated through European intellectual circles in the early 17th century described a brotherhood that claimed direct lineage from an ancient Egyptian and Hermetic knowledge tradition, one that had preserved, in encrypted form, a complete science of nature that the mainstream academic world did not possess. Whether or not the Rosicrucians existed as an organized body, their manifestos were read by the most important scientific minds of the era. Francis Bacon, Johannes Kepler, René Descartes. These are not credulous men. They are respectively the founder of the scientific method, the discoverer of planetary orbital laws, and the originator of analytical geometry. That they took the Rosicrucian material seriously enough to engage with it substantively suggests that the material contained something they recognized as genuinely connected to what they were discovering through their own investigations. In 2007, Peter Liu, a physicist at Harvard, published a paper in Science demonstrating that the geometric tile patterns in 15th century Islamic mosques encode quasi-crystalline symmetry, a mathematical concept not discovered in the Western tradition until 1974. The craftsmen who made these tiles 500 years ago were using a geometry that modern mathematicians believed they had invented. The stones remember what the books forgot. And in each era, and someone with the right eyes finds the pattern again, in the tiles, in the bones, in the spirals, in the stars, and understands for a moment what it is pointing at. What vanished most completely was the connective tissue, the tradition that explained how the mathematics, the physics, and the experience of the built environment were related to one another. The numbers survived in the stones. The geometry survived in the structures. What did not survive, or survived only in fragmentary and largely inaccessible form, was the unified understanding of why these things were connected, and what the connection revealed about the nature of reality and the human beings who inhabit it. The early 20th century produced, in the span of a few decades, a remarkable concentration of thinkers who were working independently, in different countries and different fields, on problems that the ancient geometric tradition would have recognized as familiar. They did not know they were working in an ancient tradition. They believed they were inventing. What they were, in significant part doing, was rediscovering, arriving, through modern observational science, at conclusions that the builders of the pyramids and the stone circles had encoded in stone millennia before. Nikola Tesla worked on the assumption, stated explicitly in his private correspondence and in the vision that drove the Wardenclyffe Tower project, that the Earth was a resonant sphere, that it vibrated at specific frequencies, that those frequencies could be identified, mapped, and used to transmit energy to any point on the planet's surface without physical connection. His model of the Earth was not the inert rock of standard physics. It was an energetic system, pulsing with frequencies, with nodes of concentration and pathways of flow. A model that maps with striking precision onto the ancient understanding of the Earth as a field of connected, sacred sites, positioned at points of energetic significance and linked by geometric relationships. We now know that Tesla was correct in the fundamental observation. The Earth does vibrate at specific electromagnetic frequencies, measured and documented since the 1950s as the Schumann resonances. The Earth's electromagnetic cavity resonates at approximately 7.83 Hz, with harmonics that overlap, with a precision that researchers have noted but not yet fully explained, with the range of human brainwave activity. Tesla's vision of a global energy grid transmitted through the Earth at specific resonant frequencies was dismissed as madness in 1900. By 2020, researchers had confirmed that the Earth resonates at specific electromagnetic frequencies that correspond to the acoustic resonances documented in ancient sacred chambers. Tesla was not mad. He was early. Victor Schauberger, working in the rivers and forests of Austria in the same era, arrived at a different but complementary set of observations. Schauberger spent 30 years watching water, specifically watching the difference between water that moved in straight, engineered channels and water that moved in the spiral, vorticular paths it chose when left to itself. He found that water moving in spiral patterns carried more energy, supported more biological life, and displayed physical properties that contradicted the hydraulic models of his time. The natural movement of living water was not linear but spiral, following a logarithmic path that encoded in its geometry the same proportional constants that appear in the shells and seeds in sacred stones. Schauberger was a forester who kept very careful records, and his records describe something that the ancient builders appear to have understood and encoded in the vorticular geometry of their constructions, that the universe, at every scale, prefers to move in spirals. The most interesting scientific discoveries are often the ones nobody planned. The researcher sets out to measure one thing, applies their instruments carefully, records the data honestly, and finds something in the results that their training did not prepare them for. And the history of ancient geometric knowledge in the 20th and 21st centuries is largely a history of these unplanned discoveries. Scientists who went looking for data in old places and found something older than they expected. Dr. Igor Reznikov was studying cave art, the extraordinary painted caves of France and Spain, when he noticed a pattern The paintings made by Paleolithic humans as many as 40,000 years ago were not distributed randomly across the cave walls. They clustered with a statistical consistency that ruled out chance at the locations of greatest acoustic resonance within each cave. The spots where the animal figures and handprints and geometric symbols were most concentrated were the spots where sound echoed most richly, where the cave itself responded in amplifying and returning the sound in ways the surrounding wall surfaces did not. 30 to 40,000 years before Göbekli Tepe, before agriculture, before anything our history calls civilization, human beings were connecting visual art, sacred space, and acoustic phenomenon into a deliberate practice. Reznikov published his findings. They were received with interest and then, with the particular silence academia reserves for results that do not fit the existing framework. Dr. Alistair Pike, a materials geologist, found what he was not looking for in the stone circles of Scotland. He went to study the geological origins of the stones, which quarries, which formations. What he found when he analyzed the electromagnetic properties of the selected stones was that the stones used in ceremonial circles consistently had higher than average piezoelectric response. They had been selected from geologically varied local sources, specifically for their electromagnetic properties. The people who built these circles knew that different stones had different electromagnetic qualities, and they chose accordingly. This is materials science, applied 4,000 years ago in the context of what we call ritual. A geologist analyzing prehistoric cave paintings finds that they are almost always located at the cave's acoustic sweet spot, the place where sound echoes most richly. 30,000 years ago, before language, before agriculture, before anything we call civilization, human beings were already connecting geometry, sound, and art into a unified practice. The continuity of this practice, from Paleolithic cave to Neolithic stone circle to Bronze Age pyramid to medieval cathedral, is the most extraordinary thread in the entire story. It is not a coincidence of form. It is a continuity of knowledge, transmitted in ways we do not fully understand across a span of time so vast that the word tradition can barely hold it. What all these researchers share is that none of them set out to prove anything about ancient wisdom. They set out to measure what was there, and what was there, field by field and decade by decade, was evidence of a consistent, sophisticated, physically real understanding of how geometry, material, and sound could be combined to produce specific effects in the human beings who entered the spaces built according to these principles. The surprise was not the discovery. The surprise was how long the knowledge had been waiting to be found. In the 18th century, a German physicist named Ernst Chladni performed a demonstration that has never quite lost its power to astonish. He placed a thin metal plate on a surface, scattered fine sand across it, and drew a violin bow along the plate's edge. The sand, disturbed by the vibration, did not scatter randomly. It moved purposefully, as if directed away from the vibrating areas and toward the lines of stillness, the nodes where the plate was not moving. When it settled, it had arranged itself in patterns, stars, crosses, concentric rings, complex geometric figures of extraordinary regularity. Different frequencies produced different patterns. Higher frequencies produced more complex geometry. The plates seemed to be drawing with sound. Chladni showed these patterns to Napoleon Bonaparte, who was sufficiently impressed to fund their further study. The patterns became known as Chladni figures, and they sat at the edge of mainstream science for nearly 2 centuries. Interesting, reproducible, never quite adequately explained, until the Swiss physician Hans Jenny picked up the thread in the 1960s and spent 15 years systematically documenting what happens when different materials are subjected to different frequencies of a vibration. Jenny coined the term cymatics from the Greek chyma, meaning wave, and his publications filled with images that are by any measure extraordinary. Sand and water and fine powder vibrated at specific frequencies, arranging themselves into mandalas, into hexagonal grids, into the flower of life, into patterns that look precisely like the geometric forms encoded in the walls and floors of ancient sacred structures worldwide. Pour sand on a flat plate, play a note. The sand will arrange itself into a perfect geometric pattern. Star, hexagon, spiral, depending on the frequency. Play a different note. A different geometry appears. Every ancient chamber that resonates at a specific frequency is, in the most literal physical sense, a machine for creating invisible geometry in the air. The people inside it were living inside a geometric field, and that field was changing them. This is not a metaphor. It is a physical description of what happens when any medium, air, water, sand, the soft tissue of the human body, is subjected to sustained vibration at specific frequencies. The vibration organizes the medium into geometric patterns. Its different frequencies produce different geometries. The relationship between the acoustic frequency of a space and the geometric form of that space is not incidental, it is constitutive. A space built with specific proportions resonates at specific frequencies. Those frequencies organize the air inside it into specific geometric fields, and those fields influence the media within them, including the bodies of the people present. The ancient builders who carved the flower of life into their walls were not decorating. They were showing you what the room was doing, showing you the invisible geometry that their acoustic engineering was producing in the space around you. Had you been able to see it, they could not give you the equations. They gave you the picture instead. And it has been waiting on the walls of the oldest buildings on earth for someone to understand what it was a picture of. There is a moment in the history of every field of knowledge when a finding arrives that does not fit, not slightly, not in some correctable detail, but fundamentally at the level of the assumptions on which the entire field is built. What happens in that moment is instructive. In the best version of science, the field pauses, evaluates the evidence honestly, revises its assumptions, and continues. In the version of science that operates inside human institutions with funding pressures, career incentives, and ideological investments, something different tends to happen. The finding is not engaged, it is managed. John Anthony West spent the better part of 2 decades arguing, on the basis of geological analysis, that the Great Sphinx of Giza showed evidence of water erosion inconsistent with a construction date of 2500 BCE. The Egyptian climate has been arid for most of the last 5,000 years. The deep vertical channels on the body of the Sphinx require prolonged, intense rainfall to produce, rainfall that ended approximately 7,000 years ago. This means, if the weathering is what it appears to be, that the Sphinx was standing in 5000 BCE at the latest. West brought his observation to Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University, a professional geologist with credentials in stratigraphy and paleoclimatology. Schoch examined the evidence and found it sound. He published his analysis in the Proceedings of the Geological Society of America. The analysis was solid, the methodology was standard, the conclusions were careful. The evidence suggests a construction date substantially earlier than the accepted Egyptological timeline. A geologist publishes peer-reviewed evidence that the Sphinx was built before the last major wet period in Egypt. His evidence is not challenged on scientific grounds. He is told by the president of the American Archaeological Association at a public conference that his conclusions cannot be allowed because of what they would mean for our understanding of history. Cannot be allowed, not cannot be proven, cannot be allowed. That response is not a scientific judgment. It is an institutional one, a declaration that the implications of a finding are too threatening to the existing structure of knowledge to be permitted, regardless of the quality of the evidence. And the response reveals something important. Not that the evidence is weak, but that the stakes of accepting it are, for the field's existing paradigm, existential. Scientific progress has never been as clean as its retrospective narratives suggest. Every major revision of our understanding of the world has been resisted by the people whose careers, reputations, and worldviews were built on what the revision replaced. What is unusual about the ancient history case is not the resistance mechanism, but the scale of what is being resisted. The findings are not peripheral. They concern the foundational question of what humanity is and where it came from. Academic citation is one of the most powerful tools of institutional control in the knowledge economy, and it operates almost entirely without transparency. And a paper is published in a peer-reviewed journal. Other researchers either cite it, incorporate it into the network of knowledge, or they do not. If they cite it, it enters the record, influences subsequent work, and accumulates authority. If they do not, it sits in the database, technically available, effectively invisible. No committee meets to decide not to cite a paper. Individual researchers, making individual decisions about what to include in their literature reviews, simply find that citing a particular paper does not serve their professional interests, and so they do not. The paper that challenges consensus disappears not by being refuted, but by being ignored. In academic science, silence is not neutrality, it is a verdict. The acoustic research of Dr. Rupert Till and Dr. Bruno Fazenda are published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, demonstrating that Stonehenge was acoustically designed to produce specific effects in its occupants, received fewer than 20 citations in the decade following its publication. The paper was methodologically rigorous, clearly written, and directly relevant to one of the most studied prehistoric monuments in the world. Its citation rate corresponds not to a weak paper, but to a paper whose findings that a prehistoric monument was engineered for specific physiological effects were too challenging to the existing narrative of Neolithic culture for mainstream researchers to engage with comfortably. The materials geology research of Dr. Inalistair Pike, showing that stone circle builders selected materials for electromagnetic properties, similarly entered the published record and failed to accumulate the citation network that would have made it foundational. The stratigraphy of Dr. Robert Schoch on the Sphinx, published in 1992 and never scientifically refuted, has been cited by fewer than 40 geological papers in 30 years. These are not marginal publications. These are peer-reviewed contributions to major journals, produced by credentialed researchers using standard methods. Their citation histories tell a story that has nothing to do with the quality of the science. A paper demonstrating that Stonehenge was acoustically engineered was published in a top peer-reviewed journal and never formally contested. It was simply not cited. The mechanism is not conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and more durable: institutional inertia, career risk calculation, and the entirely human tendency to look away from evidence that requires too much revision to process. Senior researchers informally discourage graduate students from engaging with controversial findings. Journal editors return submissions that build on challenging evidence with recommendations to focus on more established frameworks. Funding bodies decline applications that propose to follow up anomalous results. Each decision is made individually, rationally, in the interests of the person making it. The cumulative effect is a systematic marginalization of some of the most important questions in the entire field of ancient history. An understanding why this specific area of inquiry attracts the particular quality of institutional resistance it does requires stepping back from the evidence and looking at what the evidence threatens, not which archaeologist's career, but which story's authority. Western civilization's foundational narrative about itself goes something like this. Human beings were once primitive. They lived in small groups, close to starvation, governed by fear and superstition. Then, gradually, painfully, over millennia, they became us. They invented agriculture, then writing, then mathematics, then science, then philosophy, then technology. The line runs upward from the cave to the laboratory, from grunting to satellite communication, from the stone flake to the microprocessor. Progress is the organizing principle of this story, and that principle, that we represent the highest point of human development, yet achieved, is not just historical. It is political, economic, and psychological. It justifies the contemporary global order. It validates the institutions through which that order is maintained. It provides the moral framework within which technological development is pursued without limit. The evidence accumulated in this documentary does not challenge a detail of this narrative. It challenges the narrative at its foundation. If a civilization existed 12,000 years ago that understood geometry, acoustics, materials science, and astronomy at a level we are only now rediscovering, if the monuments they left behind are more sophisticated in certain respects than anything we have built in the intervening millennia, then the line does not run upward from the cave to the laboratory. It runs up, then catastrophically down, then slowly up again. We are not the summit. We are somewhere on the slope, working our way back toward an altitude reached and lost before our history begins. If a civilization existed before ours that understood these geometric and physical principles, and we are increasingly finding evidence that it did, then the history we were taught in school is not incomplete. It is inverted. We are not the highest point of human knowledge ever achieved. We may, in certain fields, be somewhere on the ascent. This is not a comfortable thought, and it is not a thought that institutions built on the progressive narrative will welcome or reward anyone for pursuing. But it is, increasingly, the thought that the evidence requires, and evidence, in the end, has a patience that institutions do not. It waits, it accumulates, and it does not, no matter how carefully ignored, actually disappear. There is a building in Valencia, Spain, that looks like a skeleton. Not metaphorically, its arching ribs and sweeping curves follow the proportional geometry of actual bone, the same phi ratios and Fibonacci relationships that govern the growth of living tissue. Its architect, Santiago Calatrava, didn't choose these proportions because they were aesthetically pleasing, though they are. He arrived at them through structural optimization, the mathematical process of finding the form that carries load most efficiently for a given material and span. The optimal structural form, calculated without aesthetic preference, keeps producing curves and ratios that the ancient builders would have recognized. Not because they were copying nature superficially, but because they understood what Calatrava's algorithms are now confirming. The proportions of living things are the proportions of optimal structure. Any design process rigorous enough to find the best answer will find the same answer that nature found first. This convergence between contemporary computational design and ancient geometric proportion is one of the most quietly significant developments in architecture of the past 30 years. It does not announce itself as a rediscovery of ancient wisdom. It announces itself as the result of parametric modeling and generative design algorithms. But when you look at the forms these tools produce, and then look at the forms ancient builders produced, the family resemblance is undeniable. Engineers feeding structural optimization problems into modern algorithms are discovering that the mathematically ideal solution, the form that is strongest, lightest, and most efficient, keeps generating the same proportions, the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, the same numbers the ancient builders used. The algorithm did not invent them. It found them, just like the ancients did. Zaha Hadid architects, the practice that pushed parametric design further than any other in its generation, and describes its formal language as biomorphic, drawing inspiration from biological growth processes. The recursive, self-similar geometry of its facades and interior surfaces is, in its mathematical structure, fractal, the same pattern repeating at multiple scales, the way a tree or a coastline repeats its character at every level of magnification. Hassan Fathi, the Egyptian architect, who spent the mid-20th century rediscovering and applying traditional Nubian and Islamic building proportions, found that buildings designed according to these proportions maintained more stable internal temperatures, required less mechanical intervention to achieve human comfort, and were consistently rated by their occupants as more pleasant to inhabit than modernist buildings of comparable size. He was not surprised, and he had been working from the assumption that the proportional systems he was applying had been refined over millennia of empirical observation. The findings confirmed what the tradition had always claimed. The ancient builders were right about the geometry. We are only now building the instruments to measure how right. There is a growing body of research in environmental psychology telling us, with the precision of the modern laboratory, something that the builders of Newgrange and Göbekli Tepe apparently knew well enough to cut into stone. The geometry of the space you inhabit affects the state of your body and mind in ways that are real, measurable, and significant. The field that has coalesced around this research goes by the name biophilic design. And while the name is new, the observation it is built on is ancient. The foundational study in this field is Dr. Roger Ulrich's research, published in Science in 1984, comparing hospital patients recovering from surgery who had views of natural, organically patterned landscapes with patients in identical rooms with views of a brick wall. The results were not subtle. Patients who could see natural forms recovered faster, experienced less post-operative pain, used less pain medication, had shorter hospital stays, and rated their experience as more positive. The difference between the two groups was a window, specifically a window with the right geometry visible through it. Fractal geometry, organic curves, the proportional language of living systems. Dr. Richard Taylor at the University of Oregon pursued the question of why natural geometry produces this response and found a specific mechanism: fractal patterns, patterns that repeat their structure at multiple scales, as natural forms do, produce a measurable relaxation response in the human visual cortex. Cortisol levels decrease, heart rate variability improves. Visual processing shifts from the narrow, focused mode associated with anxiety to the broad, open mode associated with rest and integration. The mathematical dimension of the fractal pattern matters. There is a specific range between approximately 1.3 and 1.5 on the fractal dimension scale that produces the strongest relaxation response. Natural landscapes typically fall in this range, so do the geometric tile patterns of Islamic sacred architecture. So do the carved facades of Gothic cathedrals. The ancient builders were consistently producing the optimal fractal dimension in their most important structures. Hospital patients who can see organic, naturally proportioned patterns from their beds use 30% less pain medication and recover measurably faster than those who cannot. This is a clinical finding, and it is exactly what ancient Egyptian medical texts described when they prescribed certain chamber geometries as treatment for illness. The biophilic design movement is not a new idea. It is the scientific confirmation of the oldest idea in architecture, that the right proportions create the right conditions for human life to flourish. The ancient builders called this per nefer, the perfect house. Modern neuroscience calls it evidence-based design. The geometry does not care what we call it. It only cares whether we build it. We have built a world that makes us sick in ways that are difficult to name. Not primarily sick from toxins or pathogens, the diseases of the modern built environment are more subtle and more pervasive. They are the diseases of wrong geometry, the anxiety that fluorescent-lit rectangular rooms produce in the nervous systems of children asked to learn inside them, the chronic low-grade stress of working in buildings designed for the appearance of efficiency rather than the actual well-being of the people inside them. The epidemic of attention disorders, sleep disruptions, and affective dysregulation that has grown in lockstep with the spread of environments designed by people who had never heard of the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, or the acoustic resonance properties of stone. The correlation is not perfect and the causation is not fully established, but the direction of the evidence is clear, and it points in a direction the ancient builders would have found familiar. If the geometric principles documented in this documentary were applied as active design principles in schools, hospitals, homes, workplaces, and public spaces, the biophilic researchers have done some of the work of predicting what would change. Buildings with fractal geometry in their surfaces, natural proportions in their spatial dimensions, and acoustic environments tuned to frequencies that support relaxation produce measurable improvements in cognitive performance, emotional regulation, immune function, and the quality of sleep in the people who inhabit them. Yet these are not speculative outcomes. They are documented in peer-reviewed research. They are the reason the most expensive corporate campuses in the world are now being designed with organic forms, living walls, and acoustic environments that feel, to the people who work in them, like something between a forest and a library. The designers of the Google campus in Silicon Valley studied the science of human well-being in built environments and arrived at spatial proportions that match, within measurable tolerance, the proportions of classical sacred architecture. Ancient Greece and Silicon Valley, separated by 25 centuries and 10,000 miles, building to the same geometry, because they were both asking the same question: what space does the human mind thrive in? The answer has not changed. The answer is the golden ratio, the fractal surface, the acoustic room that settles the body into presence, the orientation to natural light that marks the turning of time. These are not ancient mysteries. They are ancient answers. And the fact that we are rediscovering them now, through environmental psychology, through neuroscience, through structural optimization, is less a sign of our sophistication than a sign of how thoroughly we managed, in the intervening centuries, to forget something that the people who built the world's most enduring structures considered too important to leave to chance. Go back for a moment to the room at the beginning of this story, the room that changes you when you enter it, the proportioned chamber, the space that presses its silence into you the way water fills a vessel, slowly, completely, from the bottom up. You know now why it does what it does. You know the geometry, you know the acoustics, you know the mathematics and the neuroscience and the physics of the stone. You know, in the language our century uses for these things, exactly what is happening to you in that room, and knowing it does not make it less. The ancient builders understood something that our era is still working up to, that the human being is not separate from the geometry of the natural world, but continuous with it, that the same proportions governing the growth of a shell and the spacing of stars also govern the optimal proportions of a room in which a person might rest and think, and find for a moment the quality of attention that ordinary life rarely provides. They understood this not as spiritual belief, but as something they had measured in over centuries of patient observation. in the bodies and minds and lives of the people who inhabited correctly and incorrectly proportioned spaces. They built their conclusions into stone because they knew that everything else would eventually burn. Books burn, traditions dissolve, languages die, but a correctly proportioned stone room, built with sufficient care, will still be doing what it was designed to do when 10,000 years of other things have come and gone. This is what the forbidden geometry is, and this is why it was forbidden. Not because it was wrong, but because it was true. A technology for human flourishing, encoded in mathematics, applied in stone, distributed across every civilization that understood it, aimed across the millennia at the hands and eyes of whoever would eventually know enough to read it. The pyramid and the stone circle and the acoustic chamber and the Gothic cathedral and the fractal tile and the biophilic office campus are not separate things. They are the same thing, in different languages, saying the same sentence. The universe is ordered, the order is geometric, and when you build in alignment with that order, something happens to the people inside that does not happen anywhere else. Something ancient and functional and necessary. Something we do not have a precise, modern word for, though every person who has stood in the right room has felt it, without knowing why, and has not entirely forgotten it since. They did not build these structures for their own time. They built them for ours, for the moment when we would have the instruments to read what the stones were saying, and the courage to follow where the geometry leads. We have the instruments now. We have had them for decades. The question is not whether the knowledge is there. It is there. It has always been there, patient as the stone it was cut from, indifferent to the centuries we spent looking away. The question, the only question, the question that every structure in this story was built to ask, is whether we are finally ready to receive it.